Okay, so I'm just going to dive right on in, and hopefully we will be able to answer a number of questions that you may have. Basically, everyone was kind of taken aback by the impact of COVID, both in terms of how we dealt with it as families, as parents, as educators, as members of the community. We were all impacted without any doubt. The United States Department of Education has continuously provided some updated guidance, often a little bit after the fact. Same thing with our New York State Education Department, and districts and parents have worked collaboratively to try to make sure that we are continuing to ensure the delivery of education and services to all of our children, and in particular children with disabilities, who we know may have had some of the most challenging experiences, just based on the fact that we lost our consistency, our in-person and hands-on experiences, and so that has caused some impact. We know that regardless of the best interests and efforts that districts put forward, there are some students, in particular students with disabilities, who did not end up receiving all of the appropriate services that they were entitled to receive. We had issues with technology, there were problems with connectivity, there were getting devices, there was supervision in the home, simply because the child was home didn't necessarily mean that there were computer savvy family members that were there who might be able to assist and facilitate access, and a host of other issues that we really kind of dealt with. Ultimately, we are coming back to the point where CSE meetings and IEP teams are looking at what, if anything, we need to do to update current IEPs about student needs, supports, and services, as well as to make sure that we're addressing the issue of potential compensatory services for students who may have had adverse impact as a result of the loss of either in-person instruction, or were unable to access to the full extent the remote or virtual or hybrid instruction that may have been offered in the alternative. So first off, let's recognize that every student, not just students with disabilities, were impacted. And so there is a general approach and focus for all districts on trying to offset the tough year we had by addressing with all kids, making sure that we are reconnecting with them, addressing attendance, work completion, engagement, helping them connect with their school and community, and potentially addressing and managing some new behaviors that may have resulted from kind of having the wheels off for a while and coming back in full time for the first time this year, after an in and out year last year. Districts are looking at different ways to enrich and accelerate student academic achievement, including things like summer enrichment programs, many of which were offered this past summer. Also looking at other ways to address gaps. There's been realignment of schools' curriculum to try to address the shortfall of where kids, had anticipated to be completed at the end of last year and where they actually failed, to fill in those gaps and make sure that they have the foundations that they need. There's been a fair amount of professional development, working with the staff and providers to make sure that they have plans and strategies to accelerate but still deliver the content of the curriculum. And then, continuing to work on, new, different, creative and engaging learning opportunities to really help support our students as they are filling in the gaps and also continuing to move forward in their education. Also, as a result of the pandemic, we have had an influx of new social, emotional, mental health needs, and I'll add behavioral needs that may not have existed previously, or not to the same extent. And so there is a concerted effort by school districts, as well as statewide agencies and focus, to try to make sure that we are expanding our programs and services to address and support the mental health and social and emotional needs of students. You may have heard a lot from your local school districts about social emotional learning programs, different forms of community outreach, or even information about mental health services, partnerships with mental health programs and services, and bringing others in to really try to help children and families deal with the impact of what's happened with COVID, deal with the potential loss or experience of loss from having just been away from school. You know, there are kindergartners who started last year and never realized the world when you didn't wear masks and you didn't stay at separate distances and you didn't cohort. So really kind of, you know, dealing with those impacts for students, and continuing to be mindful that we have to continue to monitor to determine if either our current students who are classified or students who may now need to be classified, we keep an eye out to make sure that we're addressing those needs and, as necessary, initiating referrals and supporting them through IEP programs and services or other building and school level accommodations. Last but not least, we have a new issue called long COVID. As you have heard on the news, as you have heard from others, you know, you may even know people who have continued to experience symptoms of COVID, notwithstanding the fact that they are no longer testing positive. Things like muscle fatigue, headaches, dizziness, lightheadedness, difficulty with breathing, sleeping, something called brain fog, which is, you know, an inability to necessarily focus and concentrate. You know, and there's a list that is long as my arm. And, you know, that has added to the fact that students may have had a loss or were quarantined in order to get through the COVID period, but are also now still continuing to experience symptoms, which, again, for students who are currently classified, might require revisiting their current IEP to look at, do they need additional support services or accommodations? And for those who are not yet classified, may look at if, you know, if you have a condition that's lasting 6 months or more, may, you know, get to the point where we have a likelihood that this is something that the student may need supports and accommodations, either through a 504 plan, where 6 months is basically the difference between a temporary disability and a long-term disability. And then with IDEA, if it's an ongoing issue that's creating an adverse educational impact, it may require special ed and related services. Helen, can you make sure that you're entering people into the who are in the waiting room? I'm sorry, I see that that's popped up and everything. Okay, one other point I wanted to make sure, and hopefully you will be able to access and download this presentation. Everywhere you see the little purple, that's a highlight to a hyperlink to the documents that are referenced therein. I do that to make your life easier so you don't have to hunt down and find these documents that I referenced in past. So all of the things that you see that are purple highlights, you should just be able to click on and up it will pop. Okay, so basically, at this point, we are at a point where, one, CSEs are reconsidering and meeting to talk about where a student is at this point in time for our currently classified students, making sure that we are addressing or developing plans to support and address any lack of progress, whether it's by increasing supports and services at this point in time, whether it's by recommending compensatory services, and I'm going to go into that in much greater detail shortly, which are kind of an equitable relief to support a student who may have had a denial of faith, as well as, you know, making sure that our current students are accessing those enhanced programs and development that is available for all students, because we want to make sure that they continue to access those integrated and gen ed programs and services to which they're entitled. How are we doing that? How are we figuring out what we need and where these kids are? A lot of it has to do with gathering data, reviewing student performance information, looking at report cards, IEP progress reports, maybe talking to prior providers and teachers to see where they were and what their rate of progress was previously, and then looking at their current rate of progress and developing a plan to kind of catch them up as best we can. Looking at how do we try to avoid falling back into those same issues by making sure we maintain a healthy and safe environment. Many districts are still using a cohorting or a pod model in order to limit the amount of exposure students will have to other students or staff, just to limit, if there was an exposure, that you won't have to necessarily close down the entire school. It might be a building, it might be a classroom, to minimize the likelihood of kids having to go back to a remote or a virtual model. Also, the federal government has issued a guidance document as of September called the Return to School Roadmap. That's really kind of their guidance on what your IDEA obligations continue to be, and how we continue to provide programs in the least restrictive environment for our students with disabilities. And that really is just a ratification and a reminder that nothing has changed in terms of a district's obligation to offer a free, appropriate public education. While we may have modified the manner of delivery, the obligation to continue to offer a FAPE to our students with disabilities never changed, notwithstanding, the challenges that may have existed as a result of the pandemic. So compensatory services, and I note about compensatory services in a post-COVID-19 world because the idea of compensatory services is usually something that comes up in the form of a due process hearing, and it's an equitable remedy, which just basically means it's a way to make up for a service that the student missed. And it's a way to say, this was what you should have received, this is what you didn't receive, here's a solution to help resolve or, address the way that the student needed or should have received that support and service to get them back on track to where they would otherwise have been if they had the full delivery of programs and services. So first, the good news, there's money. There's money that is available to actually allow districts to try to catch up and provide those services to address academic and achievement gaps, to address learning loss, and potentially to provide supplemental services to kids who may have, struggled under the COVID experience. And there are a number of different financial programs. End of the day, there's some money. The challenge is, of course, finding staff, but we'll come back to that point after the fact. As I had mentioned earlier, there's a difference in terms of compensatory services versus the general learning recovery that all students are doing. Every student, let's say the great majority of all students who were in school last year or even the year before may not have made the typical amount of progress that we would have expected. That's students with disabilities and our non-disabled students. So every student is engaged in a process of learning recovery, which is to basically catch them up on the curriculum, on the content, and on what they otherwise should have as their foundational skills as they move forward. Compensatory services are specifically programs and services that are available to students with disabilities, and it's because it's a remedy to a denial of FAPE, meaning that the student either didn't receive services or the services that they may have received may not have provided student with the ability to make progress towards their goals or to participate in the program as they otherwise would have received if we were able to deliver in an in-person model, which is our typical education model. So helping understand the definitions of compensatory services with students with disabilities, New York State education guidance came out in 2020 and then again in 2021. And the nutshell is basically that there is a requirement or an obligation to remedy a denial of FAPE. How you remedy that and what that might look like is going to be very individual for each student. And ultimately, it may also be that notwithstanding the fact that students may not have received the typical delivery, they may still have made reasonable progress and had gains through the services and supports they received. But the important part is to discuss this as a question of whether or not we need to remedy or resolve a failure to provide students those critical supports and services. And that can be delivered through a variety of programs, services, supplemental services, and programs and supports. What's important to note is that compensatory services, unlike the IEP where it's implement as written, compensatory services don't necessarily have to be provided in the exact same manner or mode, or even necessarily at the frequency and duration that they might have been provided pursuant to the IEP, because again, you can't go back in time and deliver that service, so you can never fully resolve. But what you might do is look at what is appropriate for the student now, and how do we address that shortfall in a meaningful way. There's Q&As, questions and answers, that are available on serving students with disabilities during, coronavirus. That's a federal government document that included, the link is here, and really a lot of it just talked about continue to do the absolute best you can to maintain those supports and services for students during the pandemic, prioritize in-person instruction for students with disabilities to the greatest extent possible, still try to maintain integration while meeting your safety and health requirements, and then also look to creative options and supports to make sure that we are addressing student needs. And that included looking at things like extended school year programs and services. Some students, were eligible for that program for the first time, where in the past they didn't need that support, but because of COVID and because of gaps in services may have required that support. And other students, it may have been provider absences. When we had a lot of providers who were out on COVID or quarantine, that impacted the rate and delivery and frequency of services. So we also had some services being made up over summer or break and other options. Again, schools may not have been able to provide everything for students with disabilities during the pandemic, and it may have been in a different mode, whereas if they were in person, it would have been face-to-face and in a small group. When they were remote, some of our groups had to be adjusted because we didn't have the ability to get all of the same students together, so groups might have changed. But ultimately, the question comes down to whether or not the student made progress towards their goals and access the curriculum. If they did, then although it may have been provided in a different manner, it's not an automatic entitlement that they should get makeup or alternative services. But the question comes down to, if they didn't, then what is the appropriate relief, and how do we design a program to resolve the compensatory service gap and to provide a meaningful support to the student? There's no specific guidance on who makes a compensatory education decision in the law or regulation. And again, it's because compensatory education as a concept came out of case law. But what we basically look at is who makes decisions about the student and their needs, the CSE. So we go back to the Committee on Special Education, and they come together with their multidisciplinary group to, talk about what was the student's progress, what are the relevant considerations, how, did deficits or delays change, grow, shrink? Was the student making progress? Did they respond better? There were a small population of students who actually did better during pandemic and hybrid and remote learning, usually with kids with anxiety, where the not having that peer, day-to-day stuff did actually allow them improvement and progress. But we're back to the point where we need to continue to meet the needs of the entire student, and that may include, helping them deal with those strategies and challenges. So we look at what it is that the committee needs to know in order to make those decisions to provide those compensatory services. New York State came out with some specific guidance to help districts kind of come together. And when I say districts, I really mean CSEs. Help the committees on special education come together and figure out what is appropriate, when does a student need supports and services, what might that look like. Some of the key concepts are, how long was school closed, or how long was in-person learning not available, or were you providing hybrid where they were in-person learning for certain days and not in-person learning for others. We were fortunate in this area in the, the upstate capital district region, as most of our districts were able to maintain in-person services for a large percentage of our students. There were areas in the state where they were remote for almost the entire year, last year. So we had a very strong priority to provide in-person instruction, but for areas where that didn't happen, this discussion of how long schools or programs were closed or not providing in-person services may be very relevant, particularly when a student who was receiving services through a different modality, whether it's remote services, synchronous, asynchronous, were they getting packets of materials, where was the live instruction? Those things may be very different depending upon where you were throughout the region and what kinds of programs you were in and what the capacity of your child is. Not every student, particularly younger students or students with significant behavior or cognitive issues, are able to necessarily sit through instruction and lessons on a computer for the typical amount of time they would otherwise have been involved in a school district program. So we go back to, our general data information about how did the student benefit, how did they progress. That will include the data collected for progress monitoring, the IEP progress reports. We'll also look at student report cards, as well as information from parents, teachers, and the student themselves as to were they able to engage, access, and participate in the instruction and services. The second is going back to what do we have that shows us when services were provided in an alternate manner, how long that happened, were there dates and times? And again, we may have had students who had additional time where they were remote or virtual, where the rest of the school may have been live because they themselves had quarantines, protective or otherwise, or they themselves had exposure or COVID. So their amount of instructional time or service loss may be different from what their classmates would have been because it was an individual assessment. So going back to getting that relevant information together and really seeing a good picture of what happened and where we are. Second thing you look at is, is there an indication that the student did regress? Were they not making progress? Are there specific skills within the skill set that regress? One of the primary examples are social, emotional regulation, behavior skills, and social skills amongst peers and others. When kids were forced to remote, the ability to kind of, interact and engage in group activities was, still available, but it was a different format, and it may not have presented the same level of opportunity to really have students do that practice social integration, work on reciprocity, which is being able to give and take in conversations, because there may have been many other formalities and you got a screen in between, and that changes some of that dynamic. Things like reading body language also can be impacted. And we have students where being able to understand and interpret what they see can be impacted by not having that proximity to really be able to see and scrutinize someone's face or how they're standing or what they're presenting. If you don't have that in-person experience, it may change their ability to truly understand and to grow in those areas. The second part we have is taking a look at issues such as ESY, Extended School Year Services. And again, when kids are at risk of regression or will require more than a 6 to 8 week review at the beginning of the year, they may qualify for extended school year as an IDEA service. That's different than the summer school programs, which may be available for any student who were unsuccessful in passing a class or meeting the credit requirements. Some kids will have some will have both. Some will require neither, but that's always going to be a CSE consideration. And it really does require that there's documentation and evidence of regression or the need for extended review to recoup skills. How do districts look at that? We look at data of how the students perform before and after breaks. Maybe even in some kids, it's obvious between, after a weekend, that we kind of go back to ground zero and we have to rebuild that skill. And by the end of the week, we're good. And then the next week, we kind of start back again. It's Groundhog Day. And then there are other kids where it's just a matter of frequency and repetition is an ongoing process. Looking to determine if there are new needs for students as they have returned or as they are returning. We've got, kids who are dealing with social emotional issues. They may have had family losses. They may, themselves are struggling with new health or medical issues. Anxiety is on the upswing for a lot of our kids, just with the uncertainty of what's going to happen. Will schools close again? There's sort of like a general sense of mourning that at any point in time school could be closed, and right now we're so happy to be back. The one thing I did notice last year as a school attorney is that there were far fewer social media issues, because the one plus about kids constantly being online is they did not want to do it in their off time. So yay, we didn't have as many harassment or bullying issues. But on the flip side, we're back to dealing with those peer issues that are starting to rise back up again. And again, some of the kids have not been working on those skills in the same way because they were remote or hybrid or didn't have the same frequency of exposure. And then the last is going back to, overall, is there a global evidence that the student has needs that either were not met or were not met to the level we anticipated that they would be met through programs and services, and trying to quantify or qualify what it is that we need to do to address those programs and changes. And again, this list of New York State considerations is part of a guidance document that they provided. It mirrors in part the roadmap on returning to school and how the federal education department is encouraging districts to think about how we quantify, qualify, and determine whether or not students require or qualify for compensatory education. And then the second part is if we decide, yes, they do, then it's a matter of how do we deliver it. When you are delivering compensatory education, some of the relevant factors are how do you provide that without diminishing A, the existing supports, B, without overtaxing the student because they've already got a new long day that they may have gotten a little bit out of sync with, and we're back to an in-person full-time program. How much is reasonable to expect you might be able to add on to that student? You have to balance that against avoiding unnecessary removal of students with disabilities from those interaction with non-disabled peers. So oftentimes they're open schedule where they are not in academic or in a other service for students in IEP, may be things that are highly desirable social opportunities like library and recess and lunch, or arts and sciences, where we're oftentimes trying not to pull kids from that, but it is a balance act because of course if we need to address this as a disability, that will take priority, but there is an ongoing conversation about what is reasonable and what can we expect from our kids that will support and help them, but not overtax them or have a reverse impact. Because sometimes, I always say, I give the example of PT. A certain amount of PT is productive. It builds muscles, it helps, increase strength and stamina, and it can help improve, an injury or a weakness. On the flip side, if you overdo PT, that opposite is you can actually re-injure or extend the injury or make things worse. So it's a matter of finding and striking that right balance as to how much comp ed to provide and over what period of time and to what duration or degree. So a couple of things that you'd look at for where else we may need to provide special ed, comp ed services, were there delays in evaluations? When COVID was at its peak, there were virtually no in-person evaluations that were happening because schools were closed, safety issues were still being developed, and a lot of parents and districts agreed to defer re-evaluation testing, even in some cases initial evaluation testing, until we could actually work face-to-face so that we could truly get an accurate measure. Some districts were able to work on certain kids to do virtual assessments, and if it still was able to provide meaningful information about a student, that may not have resulted in a delay, but there are issues where kids may have had delays in eligibility determinations and receipt of services as a result of the inability to immediately go forward with evaluations within the standard time frame and agreements to extend, but we still go back to looking at what do we do to help those child. Special ed and related services were also a big factor, and I will tell you right now, provider availability has been a big issue for my district. I work with about 70 different school districts throughout the state, and related service provider shortages are huge. And so it's a factor of providing the ongoing services because we want to meet the current IEPs. We don't want to grow that deficit, but at the same point in time, finding people available to provide those services on top of what is part of the current IEP is something that it has been a little bit of a challenge. This goes back to when I said at the beginning, there's money. The problem is are there staff? And that's really something that districts are looking into, trying to come up with creative solutions. I know some districts are working with other districts to kind of say, hey, I have this percentage of a staff member, maybe we can do this as a virtual mode for, makeup services, and some of them are collaborating and cooperating. I know we are certainly working hard with BOCES to try to hire and make available more services. And some districts are, looking at outside agencies and contractors to try to work down some of those missed hours and services. But again, being mindful of you got to support the student, but not overdo it to the point where they then are losing the benefit of it because they're just done with, a long day and everything. So we also look at other things that may not have been able to happen to the same extent we otherwise would have hoped for. Transition services, in particular, access and, transition to community-based programs and services, utilizing your OPWDD, your VOTEC, both that, your VESID and other supports were really scaled back due to the fact that many of those programs were just basically closed. So some of our transition planning and support that utilize or rely upon some of those agencies was impacted. So we need to come up with ways to address and catch up those students now that those agencies are reopening, and to have plans to make sure that our students continue on time to be able to, move forward with their education and their post-secondary plans, whether it's to transition to supported adult programs, whether it's, going to higher education, or, continuing to pursue technical or career and technical education programs and services. Those things are now, for the most part, back open and operational. So we go back to that, but we may also need to look at, do we need to do more? Do we need to increase the amount of time students are working on that? And also the question of, continued eligibility, if those things have not happened, is always an ongoing discussion. So I'm going to take a little step back, because one of the biggest questions everyone says is, well, how do we figure out what we need? Because, we know that they're not where we think they should be, but where do we quantify? How do we get this? So I want to take you a little bit back to the idea of general evaluations and then get into more specific things. So first off, during the heyday, everyone was agreeing to defer testing because, one, parents weren't comfortable having kids come in person, 2, providers weren't available, 3, we didn't want people coming into the campus. If we were able to keep it safe and clean, we didn't want anyone else on there. So we had a lot of evaluations that were deferred and delayed. So if they haven't been done, that's step 1, get those evaluations done. 2, under evaluation requirements, there are different times where a district is required to conduct evaluations. Obviously, it's part of the initial eligibility evaluation. And IDEA and New York in particular have a very prescriptive list of the required tests that must be completed as part of that initial evaluation. And then there's also the option of other supplemental tests or evals that may come out over time due to the changing needs of the student. Every 3 years, there's a requirement to either do a full re-evaluation, which may be redoing the initial evaluations, or it may be updating areas where the student continues to have needs and services, because if the student has typical academic and cognitive functioning, and it's a service providers, related services and other things, we don't necessarily want to put them through the academic and cognitive testing if there's no question that they are academically and cognitively on par. And that's where the psychologist can recommend or say, hey, we don't need to really redo that, but that's part of a discussion with parents when you're talking about reevaluation. But generally speaking, any data you gather for evaluative purposes is to help, 1, figure out, is this still a student with a disability? 2, where are they currently performing? What's their present levels of performance? What areas are need? Where are their strengths? What are their challenges? 2, sometimes you have a disability, but at this point you may have learned compensatory strategies or to use accommodations to the point that you no longer require specialized instruction and related services. It may be that you still need some accommodations or access to devices or tools, but you may no longer need that special education support. And so again, that's where we look at the possibility of declassification, but there are other options and supports that continue to be available to students that if they are exiting special ed, and that's another relevant consideration. And 2, and last, whether or not you need to change the current program and services. And again, the current information about present levels, needs, changes, all would be part of that factor to determine where is the student now, what are the student's needs, what do we do programming for the student as they currently need, and then we still have the secondary issue of what do we do if students may need additional services to address or remedy a denial of FAPE. What evaluations? As I said, there's a very prescriptive list. At a minimum, you must have a physical exam. Again, typically you will use the school health appraisal, which parents have to submit at select times throughout a student's education. Sometimes there'll be additional information or health information that's provided by the parents or that the district arranges where there are very specific health or medical issues or concerns. Individual psychological evaluation, which typically will include also education and achievement testing, and that's really cognitive functioning, understanding the students, processing how they receive information, how they can recall it, use it, memory, social, and academic skills. Social history, which is a very valuable tool, which I'm going to go into a little bit further. A classroom observation or observing the student in their typical or natural learning environment. When kids are in preschool, they're not necessarily in class, so we go see them in a preschool or in a daycare setting. When they're in school age programs, typically that observation will be in a classroom setting, or maybe during unstructured time if that's an area of concern. And then other appropriate evaluations. And this is where there's individualization and tailoring of those assessments. If the student has a speech or articulation error, you're probably going to look at speech and language evaluations. If they have difficulty with fine or gross motor skills, you may look at OT and PT. Some kids, we look at issues like TVI for teacher of the visually impaired to assess issues of vision, hearing and auditory evaluation. Vocation assessment to kind of get a sense of where the student's interests lie as part of transition planning. It's important to note that for all students, evaluations and determinations are based on a collective amount of information. It's not a one evaluation dictates everything. And it's because we really want a good universal understanding of the student's needs so that we can then move forward and develop and plan. It's also always important to consider information from the parent. Information from the student if they're age appropriate, as well as info from the teachers and other providers that are working with the student. And again, that may be pre-referral or as a result of referral intervention services or prior IEP services.
Tara, can I jump in for just a quick second to piggyback on that?
Absolutely.
I want to just reiterate to those out there that have older students that are in high school and even students that are where it is appropriate to hear from them. As a CSE, we really want to hear from the students that it's appropriate to hear from. We want to do things that the kids are going to find valuable and that they're going to buy into. So we feel like it's really important to involve them as soon as they are able to. I've come across several parents who don't want their child involved, and I have to really meet with them and talk to them about how important it is, because this is their plan and it can carry on with them when they are done with high school. This is something that we're trying to put in place so that they can be successful. So it's really important to give your kid, if they're ready, the benefit of the doubt and bring them into the conversation.
I think that typically we look for student input starting, towards the end of elementary school, definitely through middle and high school. And it's really, their level of involvement for the student will be appropriate based on the age and ability of that student. It could be that they provide a written statement. Could be they come and speak to the committee. Sometimes it's kind of daunting for a student to provide that input in a room full of adults. So they might have a meeting with someone and then, provide them information, and then that person reports out. But where we can, we do like to have that student share their input, because I always say they have to live with it. And sometimes parents, thoughts about what the student might use or need may be a little different from the students. And it's important because, again, if they're going to work with these supports and accommodations, we need to know that they'll do it. And there are often multiple ways that we can support a student. We just need to know what their concerns are, and then we can kind of work around it. But, in terms of additional evaluations, it's really when we need more, when there isn't enough information to be able to make educational determinations, to figure out if the student needs new supports and services, where there is a change in their progress or performance, such as do we need to look at, do they need compensatory services? How did they do? Where were they previously? Did they regress? If they did, how are we going to address that regression? What are we going to do to catch them back up? To help the committee understand what's going on and to really kind of look at the comparison of skills. One, the student against their own prior scores, and two, the student against norm reference standards, which gives us a sense of where the student falls in, the grand scheme of skills and abilities. I have a comment and slide on hallmarks of a good evaluation, and I will certainly invite comments or questions or ideas from Shari and from Wayne on this point. For me, I look at a lot of evaluations because I sit in on different meetings when parents are represented by counsel. And I will tell you that I have seen good, bad, and indifferent evals. There are many that are good. There are many that are, cover. There are some that are in need of improvement. In those instances, I certainly do some follow-up with the districts. But there are a couple of things that I find that are common to good evaluations. One is, you know who the evaluator was. They signed it, they dated it. We know the name, age, grade of the student. Every once in a while, there may be a disconnect between the student's age and grade and the level that they were compared with. So it's important to know how old they were and what grade they were in and what specific evaluations were used so that we can verify and validate them. It should include information from multiple sources. Again, the evaluation should take into consideration parent input, student input, teacher, current providers. May include information that is shared by parents from outside providers or other agencies that may be working with the student. It should definitely identify why we're doing the eval. And it can be, a referral was made, but usually the referral is made because of concerns in specific areas. And that gives us the understanding so that we can make sure when we're evaluating sufficiently to get the information to help us develop and support a plan for that student. Usually an evaluation will provide a summary of what the evaluator considered and reviewed, including the people that they talked to, the documents that they may have reviewed. It may include some prior assessment summaries for comparison, saying I did these evals and then here's the tests that I did do as part of the new assessment. And it may include both functional assessment, that could be an observation or checklist or communication, as well as a more formal or clinical assessment, which can be using standardized measures, doing professional clinical observation of specific skills, and otherwise using, norm reference evaluative information. And norm reference just simply means it's been scored against others of the same age or the same, grade level across the nation, and that, going to give us a general ballpark of what we look at for skills.
Hi, Tara.
And then,
do you mind if I jump in with a question?
Absolutely.
Someone asked, as a parent, can we get the full evaluation? We usually just get a high level.
I'm sorry, we usually just get a what?
It says high level. I'm guessing not the full evaluation, just a piece of it.
Okay, so on an initial evaluation, you must conduct all of those evals. On a re-evaluation, that's that eval that you do maybe every 3 years, you may conduct those same evals. You may selectively evaluate if there are areas that we have already ruled out or that the student does not currently need. And you might choose to add additional evals that had previously not been done because of the age of the student or new needs or concerns. So what is done is part of a CSE recommendation. There are standard evals that they may typically do, but they always need to individualize that to a particular student. If you as a parent or as a committee member have concerns about specific needs of the student, you may want to give that information to the evaluators, and that may tailor them to look towards other assessment measures or resources in order to program appropriately. Somehow the last sentence faded off. It was to assist in, it should have said decision-making, but somehow I erased the word decision-making from that last sentence, so I apologize. Shari or Wayne, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, one of the things that I'm going to guess that Wayne would concur with, because I'm thinking of the evaluations that we've had on his son, and it's so important that we get the outside evaluator or whoever is doing the evaluation, if it's in-house, to come in and see the student in the classroom. Sometimes parents will go and have what I call an outside eval, and it comes in, the student had been into the provider's office for several hours and they have a whole bunch of recommendations. They've never spoken to the school team, and we find that is not very effective. We really need the providers and the evaluators to know what's happening in the school setting. Would you think the same, Wayne, or what would you think?
Yeah, I would. I mean, in our case, because of our son's situation, he had to actually go in 2 different sessions to the outside evaluator. But I thought that it really worked hand in hand with the behavioral analysis as well. I think they worked together because she came into the school, Kelly Brock, and really just had this, being that third person, that outside party, was able to kind of look at it from like a non-biased, thing, and just look at the child in the classroom setting and figure out, the behaviors and things that were going on. And then she was able to kind of get with Dr. Cosgrove and the full assessment she did, psychological, educational, etc. And they were able to kind of combine those together to really help my son's progress a lot. And this was in the middle of COVID, so it was really a great way to combine everything and actually really see what's going on in the school. Because I don't think Dr. Cosgrove ever went into the classroom setting. It was all just done in her office with my son. But like I said, her and Kelly Brock got together to, because they all work together, the behaviors and sorry about that, I got work bothering me. The behaviors and the whole educational thing and the psychological thing, it really all goes together. If that makes any sense, what I'm saying, but I felt it worked hand in hand. And I think if you're going to get that full psychological educational evaluation, you really have to get a behavioral evaluation as well and kind of bring those two professionals together.
I think that there's a lot of components that go into developing and identifying the appropriate assessments for students, and it will vary very much based on how that student presents, what their needs are. I always go back to the I in IEP, which is individualized. And although the state requires that we follow very specific evals, there's always the need to look at within those evals and modify the test based on how the student presents and what their needs are. So I'm going to just briefly I don't know the familiarity of everyone with the types and nature of evals, so I'm just going to kind of cover them quickly. But for example, psychological and a psychoeducational evaluation, which is, typically it's going to include your cognitive comprehensive assessment, includes academic and achievement testing. It may look at specific areas like reading or math or spelling. How those measures are selected and what measure used are going to depend on the age of the child. It's going to depend on whether or not the student is verbal or nonverbal, what their level of communication might be, what is appropriate within the scope or protocol of the evaluation, and other factors. So that's really, we don't use one test for every kid. And so some of the tests, like the TONI, is the test of nonverbal intelligence, which gives you intellectual and cognitive functioning of a child, but doesn't rely upon oral communication, because there are some students who are nonverbal or minimally verbal. So giving them an oral response test does not give us the information we need. The WISC, which is the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, may be used in a large number of cases because that is a more typical cognitive performance measure that looks at kids across, cognitive, intellectual processing speed, verbal comprehension, working memory, and other elements. But again, even within those skill sets, they may have specific subtests that they'll add to get more information. And other times where the student's screening subtests look fine, they may not go into additional testing because it wasn't necessary. Things that give you a more academic overview, the Wyatt is, I forget what the Wyatt stands for. I think it's I cannot remember. It's an academic and achievement testing. Woodcock Johnson does a lot with reading, math, and comprehension. Certain other measures like the BASC, which is the Behavior Assessment Scale for Children, and the BRIEF, the Behavior Rating Inventory of Executive Functioning. She remembers many of these. Really give a social, emotional, or an understanding of the student's internal or self-directed motivations, their emotional regulations. And some of these different instruments and a combination of all of those will typically be administered to just get a baseline of how is the student thinking, how is the student processing information, what is their level of communication capacity, what is their memory, how long does it take them to understand and retain information, and what can they demonstrate in terms of their knowledge. That's basically what you're looking for when you look at psychological and educational eval. But again, no one test defines that child, and that gives you one piece, but you still need to look at other pictures that may include the physical evaluation. A lot of times people kind of skip the physical evaluation and just sort of bypass it, but that's going to let you know if there are hearing or vision issues, if the student may have something like a medication which may have, a side effect like fatigue or, headaches or blurred vision, anything that might impact the student as a result of what their health or medical needs are, that can be relevant to how we plan and program for the student. And sometimes we also get other information from other providers, frequency and duration of treatment, whether or not the student is going on or off medication. Again, whether or not a parent chooses to have a child take medication is an individual determination, but when kids are changing that up, that may change the way they present at school. So those things are relevant and helpful. And it also may be relevant for where you may need to provide reasonable accommodation. If the student has physical restrictions, you may need to provide access to assistive technology. You may need to provide adaptive, resources, desks, height, chairs, materials, anything. So understanding the physical and health needs of the student is absolutely irrelevant. Social history is one that I think can be incredibly valuable because it's kind of, how did we get to here related to the student? So it's about their developmental milestones, family history, and other factors at home or in the community that may affect educational progress. And that can be, the student may have had multiple moves. This may be their 5th school inside of 2 years. The student may have been homeschooled for an extended period of time. The student may have been in different private schools, may have gone from one state to another. Each of those things can have an impact on education. And while it may not be, immediately obvious, there are changes, and transitions also impact students, and sometimes it takes them a while to get back to grounded. So understanding how the student has developed and what impact or challenges they've had gives us more information to plan and program accordingly. OT evals, occupational therapy, that really is kind of your fine motor skills. They can include everything from sensory processing to motor functioning, visual motor, task integration, dexterity and coordination, your ability to hold things, move things, manipulate them with your hands, your ability to access and use adaptive tools and equipment, as well as being able to perform what I call the ADLs, the activities of daily living, self-care, feeding yourself, cleaning yourself, using toileting, physically transferring, yourself if you need to, and being able to respond and take in and respond to sensory input from your environment. Things you hear, see, smell, all of those things are potentially relevant if you have a student who presents in those ways. Not every student is going to have sensory processing issues. So not every student may require that particular test, but we might do screenings and decide, yes, there's a concern, so we're going to do more. We might do a screening and rule out that we need to do something more in depth. But again, these are just some of those things. I will not even attempt to pronounce the different types of tests. I just listed some of the common tests. And again, there's no, you have to use this test or you don't use this test. It's just a list of them, but generally speaking, it's to give us information about fine motor, coordination, dexterity, motor processing, and motor coordination for students. And that really is just, helps us understand how they write, how they move, how they can coordinate and manipulate things, what they may need to have in order to be able to demonstrate writing or communication skills. Physical therapy is kind of the flip side of that. So we have our fine motor, now we look at our gross motor, and that can be things like stamina, your dynamic balance, your ability to stay, in one place, your proprioceptive input, which is who you are in space and place, which is, do you know where you begin and end? Some kids don't have great proprioceptive input, and so when they walk down the hall, they lean against the walls or they bump into other people, not because they're trying to be difficult or annoying, but because they just don't know where I end and you begin. So understanding some of those things, looking at functional mobility, being able to transfer from one seat to another, especially wheelchair transfers, ambulation, getting from point A to point B, and then, your just basic gross motor skills, holding a position, being able to sit in upright learning posture, floor on the floor and back straight type thing, being able to balance and to, demonstrate the coordination you need from a more gross motor physical skills. Again, a lot of the same tests that we use for OT may be used for PT, but they'll look at it more in the gross motor skills versus the more fine motor skills. Speech and language eval, again, it's how you understand and communicate. What do you need to know about the student's ability to receive, process, and utilize written, spoken, oral, or auditory input? And that can vary very much from kid to kid. That's why there are different tests, some that are nonverbal, some that are verbal, because not every child is able to communicate orally. So with some of them will be using pointing and directing. Some of them, where kids can't read at the same level, we may need to adapt and give them alternative means of demonstrating their knowledge and communication. And in those cases, we look at consistency, accuracy, whether or not they are responding, and does it relate to the question that was posed. There are different subtests. If we're looking at articulation, they'll probably use the Goldman-Fristow, which is, a test of articulation, go through the different sounds and identify, if the student struggles with sounds, does replacements or swaps. There's something called I think it's called spoonerism, like where you flip the word. So instead of spaghetti, you say paschetti. Some of those things are just different sound or practice issues. And then there are others about processing written information, auditory information, verbal information. All of that just comes to understand, how do you communicate with the world in whatever means, manner, or format you do. And that helps us understand how information should be presented to you, how you may be called upon to present information to others. And each of these evaluations, give us what we need to know about the child, and then can be done again to give us more information, so you can compare the results of the prior test with the current test and see what's their growth, what's their progress, are there more targeted areas that we need to focus in on. There are other evals, and you could do vocational assessments. That's really to prepare for transition, what's the student's interest and aptitude. You can do assistive technology, your functional behavioral assessments, your behavior intervention plan. There's the sky is the limit. TVI, teacher of the visually impaired, is a very specific assessment for students who have low vision or blindness, because you need to understand, beyond what they understand, but also how can they access, what do they need to do? Do they read Braille? Do they need things in super large print? How big is the necessary size, and things like that. FBAs and BIPs are functional behavioral assessments and behavior intervention plans. That's really where you kind of boil down to, we have these behaviors that are interfering with learning, figure out what is motivating the behavior, how is that impacting the student's understanding and learning, what's reinforcing. And there's a question of consequence. People are like, the consequence is what happens to the student, but the reality is the consequence is what is reinforcing, what is the kid getting out of performing that particular behavior that makes them want to keep doing it, because they're getting something out of it. And so understanding that, and then once you know why they do what they do, then you can develop plans to control the environment or antecedents, things that happen before that may trigger or contribute to the behavior. What do you do in the heat of the behavior, and how do you teach replacement or other behaviors to eliminate, reduce, or, just terminate a particularly problematic behavior. And that's all part of, getting to understand the student from, an intensive level, and that may require behavioral specialists or others who have more unique knowledge about understanding behavior and process. So when we get these evals, whether they are, district evaluations or others, you're going to come back to the Committee on Special Education and you're going to review them. Any report should be reviewed and considered by the CSE. Does that mean you are going to read through that report word for word and recite it at the meeting? I hope not. Typically we'll try to encourage districts and parents to share reports and information in advance, so that you can really focus in on a highlight of that information and not necessarily go through it line by line. I am, not a fan of people getting a report at the table, because that puts you in a disadvantage, and that's, other staff as well as, the parent, because you should have time to process that. When a report is handed to you at the table, oftentimes I may say that report may need to be revisited at another meeting, because you want people to have time to review it and process that information. Best way to avoid that, exchange records and information in advance. The evaluation provides information which can be helpful to determine how the student's needs, present levels are defined, and to give guidance or ideas on how to support and, provide for a student. But again, there is a cross consideration of other reports and evals, because let's say speech and language testing identifies that the student has some social pragmatic language skills, meaning they have difficulty understanding how to interact and relate with others socially in communication formats. On the flip side, we may have from the psych ed that they have a high degree of anxiety, and that may be really what's contributing to that social language deficit. So if you just looked at one report, it might be, okay, we're going to provide speech and language assessment and assistance. But when you look at it in the context of anxiety and other mental health issues, you might change the way you would present that, which is why we look at all the reports and then come to recommendations, programs, and services. So don't rely on one measure, but look at the collective information for the child as a whole, and that will really help you understand. The CSE then takes all that information, boils it down, identifies present levels, needs, continued eligibility, what types and programs of services, accommodations, modifications, testing accommodations, and a variety of other supports that may be required. A recommendation from the committee is sent out in writing. It's called the prior written notice, and I know it's confusing because it's sent out after the meeting, but it is prior to implementation of the IEP, and so that's where the prior comes in. And that just explains the decisions of the committee. And at that point, parents always have the right to, disagree or challenge the decision or recommendation of the committee. There's a variety of different options: mediation, due process, or in this case, and which is relevant to our conversation, to request an independent educational evaluation when there is a disagreement with the district evaluation. So what happens if there's disagreement? It really does depend. There are more than one way to try to resolve. Sometimes we can continue to work, very collaboratively and say, you know what, let's come back, let's take a moment, pause, regroup, and then come back again at another meeting. Sometimes we'll say, let's do some additional assessment. You're raising good points and I don't have those answers, let's do more. Sometimes we'll say, testing isn't giving us what we want because the way the student tests is different from the way they perform day to day. So maybe it's better to do data collection and see, let's look at these specific skills or issues and find out the frequency or how often they're happening and come up with, a different approach to that. Sometimes we'll just say, okay, here's where we're at today, but why don't we come back in 6 or 8 weeks, see what else, has happened between then, see if some of these new strategies or supports are working, and if not, it's not that long, so we can come back and change and adjust them. Classrooms observations can sometimes be helpful if that wasn't part of a recent eval, to go back and see how they're doing on the day-to-day level in the classroom amongst peers. And then, consultants are also helpful. Sometimes they come in as part of an IEE or an independent evaluation, and other times the district will just recommend, let's bring in someone who has particular knowledge or experience or expertise that may be beyond what we feel we've got, or it's a unique case. Like there's some students have, rare or, the quote unquote orphan diseases where there's not a whole lot of people who are very familiar about it. Example of, being PANS or PANDAS, which is, a very unique condition that, has a lot of different implications, but it's not a very common condition as opposed to diabetes or seizure conditions, which, pretty much we have a very wide audience that can weigh in on those things. And then in addition to requesting an IEE at public expense, there's mediation and due process, which are the two other options available under procedural safeguards. You can also, file a complaint with the state. I didn't include it in the context of, this because it's really trying to resolve the disagreement. A state complaint, is really when you're alleging there's a specific violation. But, in the cases where there's disagreement, we're usually trying to get to an answer on it. We're not necessarily looking for the state to step in. So I didn't include state complaint, but that is also another option available. So we've mentioned it a couple of times, and coming back to what is an independent educational evaluation? It is basically another look at a student and another assessment that is performed by someone who is not employed by the district and who is either equally or similarly qualified. And it can be at public expense if the parent requests it in writing in response to an identified disagreement with the district eval. generally speaking, an independent educational evaluation is going to be something that will be utilized by, the committee. And first and foremost, I think every good private independent evaluator should look at what was the district's eval. So that one, we're not duplicating testing, and they may look at that to see what they might want to supplement or drill down on. Two, an IEE, should involve some exchange of information between the district and the provider and the parents and the provider, and possibly the teachers and the evaluator, because there's a lot of information that can help inform that assessment and task. And, last but not least, they're going to potentially, be an evaluator who can do the test within a reasonable time frame. Districts can't say it must be within X amount of time, but if the parent is saying, I disagree right now and I want a new evaluation, our hope is that it's not going to be a 10 or a 15-month wait. Because if our concern is where are we now, you want to report an evaluation that gives us a timely response. So, independent evaluations can be invaluable. They, in some cases, will validate information that the district identified. In other cases, it may differentiate or provide further explanation in particular areas. There are, times where an independent evaluator may have a very different impression. End of the day, IEEs are triggered by disagreement with a district evaluation. District can either do one of three things. They may either approve the IEE request. Typically, they'll say, here's our district policy. Here's a list of, evaluators that are in the area. You can choose from them, or you could pick somebody else, but they're going to need to, have these basic criteria. And, once you identified someone, will reach out and contract with them and say, here's what we've got, and then we'll release records and information so that they can then begin that process. Or alternatively, the district can say, hey, I think we did a fantastic evaluation, and I'm not, we are disagreeing with your request for an IEE, and then the district has to initiate a hearing to, defend its evaluation or show that its policy or procedures were appropriate. Every once in a while, a parent will get their own eval and then hand it over to the district without having commented or communicated with the district. And then they might say, hey, I want this to be reimbursed. In those cases, the district can either, determine that they agree to reimburse or deny, and then they may need to go to an impartial hearing to defend that the evaluation was obtained, did not meet the district criteria, or did not include any value added, or otherwise, would not be subject to reimbursement. And then every once in a while, we have hearing officers who will order an eval by someone independent from the district to just get like a different perspective on a key issue. If that does happen, then those are done at the expense of the district. And again, typically it's going to fall within the district's evaluation policy. Shari or Mr. Hurd, do you want to weigh in on the issue of IEE, since I know both of you have some thoughts on this particular issue?
Yeah, first, number one, it's really important for the parents to work together with the CSC, especially the chair, in our case, Shari, because that made a huge difference to be on the same page, but I think that I know that his independent educational evaluation was really the key to the progress that we're making now this year. Because last year, we know COVID made everything worse. We all know that. But he was also going into middle school for the first year and in 5th grade, which in our district, it goes to the middle school. So it was tough all the way around. And there was a lot of problems. We had a lot of problems. And at that point, where it really helped me as a parent is, I'll be honest, as his mom and I kind of differed at the beginning of the year when we had a lot of huge problems, where I wasn't sure if he belonged in a mainstream school in a special ed class. I just wasn't sure. His mom was. Some of his providers weren't even sure at the time. And that independent educational evaluation really helped us understand that, yes, my son belonged there. He was in the right place, but we needed to work together to come up with the right plan to make it work. It really all did come together with that. And so not only did it, obviously it's all about the child, but it helped the parents, it helped the providers all come together and really make progress. That's what it was all about. Instead of like us being kind of pushed apart, because that can happen a lot where the parents don't trust, and then the providers think the parents are being, maybe too hard and don't understand exactly what they're dealing with in this classroom setting. And I think just having that outside evaluation with a real professional that we all agreed on just kind of brought everybody together and allowed us to take that advice and really come up with a plan. And like I said, all the evaluations work together, whatever that specific child needs, in our case, the behavioral, etc. But the thing that brought it all together was that IEE. It really was. It really helped a lot. So, I'll leave that to Shari to.
I would agree. It was, I said at the beginning, for those that signed on a little early, the Perrys and I have known each other since their son was in preschool, and he's now a 6th grader. And we've gone back and forth. We've had ups and downs, and this IEE was a good idea. They approached us there. We had a conversation. I think the parents' approach to the district is important too. You don't want it to be adversarial. You don't want to have this come out of a hearing. You want to have a conversation and look for more information. I've had parents approach, and we didn't feel that another evaluation was warranted. But, in this case, we had a conversation and all came to agreement, and it really was a good experience. So I appreciate your comments, Mr. Perry. Thank you.
And the one other thing I'd like to add, which I felt was very important for us, because sometimes even like providers didn't even understand, like we have through ALG, alternative, or was it alternative working group? I forget what they are. Alternative living group, ALG. We have an educational advocate who we've also had since basically preschool, who helps us understand like our child's rights, our rights, how to work with the school. And, with that, we didn't even know about like evaluations and those sort of things. So I think for parents too, that's very helpful to get somebody to kind of help them get through the process, because where she was really good was when we did have our adversarial moments, which is going to happen. It's great to have somebody there who can calm you down and say, we have to look at this, from the outside, not just as parents, because like Shari said, you can't be adversarial with this, and you can't come out of a hearing with this, and we got near those points sometimes. And it was our educational advocate that said to us, listen, once you get to that point, you're not going to make the headway you want anymore. So we really need to, be calm and look at this, without personal feelings, because it's hard when you're a parent, So I do think that schools have to be open to parents using that kind of help, such as an educational advocate, because it has been very helpful for us. I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, and I agree that, educational advocates, hopefully many of which are already part of the special ed task force, I think that one of the things that our task force really does focus on is the importance of collaboration and communication. It's understandable that we may not all be on the same page at every moment in time, because everyone has different goals or needs or impressions of where the student's skills are, what their abilities are, what the capacity may be at a given time, and that changes. And sometimes, we need to get a current update and a look at it. But where there is disagreement, you're always looking to try to come to a mutually agreeable resolution, because ultimately we want to come back to what is appropriate for the child and how do we work forward, recognizing that when you're working with school districts, you have a long-term relationship. And I always go back to, if we get an additional evaluation, what will it tell us that we don't know, and how can that information be helpful? When there's collaboration, when you can provide the communication, I think it can be a very valuable tool. I mean, there are many wonderful evaluators who, do work with districts, work with parents, and understand that, there's a difference between kind of the clinical approach versus the school approach. And that nuance is important to understand. But at the same point in time, they're taking a fresh look, and more information is 99% of the time usually better. I did want to draw your attention to one interesting situation. We had an unusual case out of New York's Federal District Court. We're part of what we call the Second Circuit. The entire United States is developed into circuits, meaning, there's little areas that come together. We're in the Second Circuit, and the only place to go beyond the Second Circuit is to the United States Supreme Court. So when the Second Circuit issues a decision, we stop and take a look at it and pay attention. They had an unusual case not too long ago. It was actually in September of 2020, but the State Education Department picked it up and reviewed it and felt it was important enough to issue a memo about it in January 2021. Let me give you a little bit of the background of the Trumbull case. Basically, there was parents who had, there were a number of different faith challenges, but one of the key issues was whether or not the parents were entitled to reimbursement and funding for a private independent evaluation they obtained, and whether or not they were timely in challenging the last district evaluation. Little bit of the background. This was a highly contested case. There was definitely a lot of litigation that had been going back and forth between the parent and the district. I think this was like the third or fourth due process hearing. So you got that backdrop that was relevant. Second, the district had recommended updated evaluation for the student, and the parent did not sign consent, but then went out and without notice to the district arranged a private evaluation, came back in and said, here you go, we want you to pay for that. Again, there is a process through which you can request an IEE, and it's typically triggered by a disagreement with a district evaluation. Interestingly enough, the court said, we're going to meet you halfway on each. So everyone's going to be happy and everyone's going to be sad from the result of this decision. They didn't actually say that, but that's my interpretation. So one of the questions is, how long do you have to challenge a district evaluation? Cases have interpreted that there's a 2-year statute of limitation to the IDEA. So obviously the answer must be 2 years. And that had been typically the interpreted response. But the court said, well, hang on a second, not necessarily, because if their district hasn't updated testing, then they can challenge that. But the difference is that the standard of whether or not that evaluation was appropriate will be based on what was done at the time and how the student was functioning at the time, not you get a new evaluation 3 years later and then say, I am now challenging the appropriateness of your evaluation. It's not going to be, here's my skills, here's the skills then, so you can see how there's a difference. That's not the standard against the comparison. But it is important to note that, for districts, that parents may challenge an evaluation longer than, 2 years past. But it's important to also note that as a district and a parent, you always have the option of updating evaluations. You don't have to do it every 3 years. If there is a relevant reason to potentially update evaluations, you might do it sooner. Like again, when there's a change in the way the student presents, when there's a dramatic difference, if the student is suddenly presenting as very depressed and anxious, you may want to look into that more intensely in that particular area. Whereas in the past, when they were a happy-go-lucky little kid, you didn't have that issue. But you can always evaluate more often. And that was really the court's message, which is if you don't evaluate more often, then you run the risk that a parent may challenge an older evaluation. On the flip side, going to the second, where the parents had obtained a private evaluation saying, well, we wanted an independent eval, and the district said, no, because you don't have a right to challenge that. The court said, agreed, because they determined that the comprehensive eval, that big eval with all the mandated tests, that was what they intended when it was a comprehensive evaluation. And that's why if a parent requested a disagreement with that comprehensive eval, they could get an independent eval at public expense. But they said an FBA, and in this case, the kid had multiple FBAs that were done, every spring, separate and apart from the formal eval. And it was really just to kind of get an update on where the student was. The court said, now, wait a second, that is not a comprehensive eval. That's a standalone tool. So no entitlement to an IEE if you disagree with that. That was a surprise, because many parents and districts have agreed and provided reimbursement and funding for an IEE functional behavioral assessment, and Mr. Perry's situation being the exact example, because there was a component of a functional behavioral assessment as part of that evaluation. But this was the court's determination. In the end, here's what I take away from it, and this is really what the state guidance is: that be aware that if you feel you need more information, you always have the ability to go back and get updated information. So the district and parents can request updated testing, as needed. The second on the request for an IEE is if you do not agree to fund an IEE, recognize that you may have to go the due process route to challenge. And on the flip side, as a parent, timing and where and how you develop and request IEEs is something you should be mindful of, because there are a number of different rules and regulations, and getting an eval initially and then handing it over to the district and then asking for reimbursement is not a guarantee that you'll get reimbursed, because there is a process. And then publicly funded IEE is triggered by a disagreement with the district eval and a request to the district to fund an IEE. So when you come and get it in and bring it as a fait accompli, it's already done. That's not, and again, often when those cases happen, the parent and the district evaluator and the private evaluator haven't had any communication. They may not have even had the report. So it's not necessarily as, helpful as it could otherwise be to, look at, here's what was done, here's what I've done, and, how I come to same, different, or alternate opinions. So, to me, the IEE process can be a valuable one when it's used to resolve issues and disputes. I think it is very important when you are doing an evaluation and getting an IEE that there be communication, because our goal is to get an evaluation or information that we can all agree to. And so that really is where you're coming out of it, and you're hoping that it will resolve the dispute or issue that is still sitting forth. So whenever we get an evaluation, regardless of whether it's a parent-funded evaluation at their own private expense, whether it's an IEE funded at public expense, we are still going to review it and consider it. So if the parents chose and paid out of pocket but bring the report in, this committee is going to review and consider it. If it's a publicly funded evaluation, the committee is going to review and consider it in conjunction with its own reports and evaluations, as long as it meets the, the district's criteria and the person who, completed the evaluation is appropriately qualified. If those things did not apply, then that may impact, what weight, if any, is given to the private evaluation. But ultimately, it doesn't mean that anything that's in a district eval or a private evaluation, if it's listed as a recommendation or a program proposal, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the end of the discussion. To me, the report gives ideas, and then the committee makes recommendations and decisions. So I think it's important to have that information, but it's also, to go back to the same point, which is there are many different ways you can approach and support a student, and sometimes you have one idea in mind, but be open to the consideration of other options that may equally address that need or support. And if you have questions and concerns, take them to the committee and discuss and review them. And sometimes having, prior discussions with the evaluator to let them know your concerns and what your concerns were with the district report can be particularly helpful, because then they can sort of target looking at those particular issues and making sure that we go forward. Oh, I've just noticed that there's a couple of other announcements that popped up in the chat box, so I don't know if anyone else sees that, but if not, please feel free to do so. Okay, so last but not least, we've talked about evaluations, we've talked about when and why we do them, we've talked about independent education evaluations, and we've talked about compensatory education services. Now the question is how do we do it? How do we deliver? What do we do? And what are our options? So that's really where I wanted to kind of visit for a moment. And again, we have the current IEP. Whatever the CSE recommended for that child on the current IEP must be implemented. So our goal is, one, to make sure we're providing a FAPE for the current school year and that the student is receiving those supports and services. That's step one. On top of that, we can look at different ways to address missed or denied services, and you may look at that through a variety of different options. Some districts are doing like a little bit of an early arrival option or a late departure option where kids may be getting a little bit of service before and after school to kind of fill in and make up some missed services. Others may be doing the extended school year or even just getting other services provided over summer if they didn't qualify for ESY as a means of trying to make up those missed or absent services. We have some cases where districts and parents agree to what I call the bank, saying, okay, we believe that you missed X number of services. Let's talk about what's reasonable. Let's talk about how it would work and say, okay, they missed X number of group services, but if we're going to make it up, it'll probably be individual. So we're going to say, this is our magic number, which we think will address that. X number of hours are available, and we'll kind of set it aside, and then you can kind of use it or draw down upon it over a period of time. Usually that's got a beginning and an end time. And, that way you can kind of try to get those additional services when it works for the parent and the child, as well as the district. Often in those cases, they're using an outside provider and it's kind of a reimbursement setup. Other times it may be we have a bank of hours and the district staff will be available to deliver it, at certain dates and times, and, they'll go on a every month basis. The parent will say, I can take these 2 dates, and then we keep, working off those hours to try to help get the student back to process. Sometimes we will do, an agreement that there's X number of hours, but we'll have like an extended time frame. So we're not going to add it on top of the kids' already long and arduous day, but we're going to say we're going to get these hours in between now and 2 summers from now. And then that gives us time to work on breaks and over winter break, over the summer break, and even during long breaks to maybe try to catch those periods up. Each one of these are just different strategies or ideas that can work. There is no one, this is the right one or this is the wrong one. It's just different ways to do it. There is also provision, at least for now, of potentially extending students' eligibility beyond a school year to continue to complete the high school diploma, even if they would otherwise have aged out. There was unique legislation that was passed this past year, and so students who would otherwise have graduated during the 1920 or 2021 school years may come back and complete their education if they were otherwise unable to do so as a result of pandemic. Many districts already kind of address those issues, and so there shouldn't be that many kids where this is a current issue. And that may be that they, did ESY services, or they provided, conditional, transition supports, or whatever it was that the student missed. And in, certain occasions, they are, giving students additional time or additional, services into a year beyond when they otherwise would have otherwise exited. But that's always going to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. And we also have had some situations where the district has said, we want to offer these services, and the parents say, no, I appreciate it. I hear what you're doing, but we've done everything. And, my kid's tired, we're tired. We just don't want to add this to our plate at this point. And they may say, I want to decline. That's fine. Parents have that right to do so. Sometimes we'll talk about, are you sure you want to do that? Maybe we can do the bank option or others. But if the parent says flat out, no, I don't want it, then the district can document that determination in writing that we made a recommendation offered and parent declined. That's fine. They know their child, they know what they're willing to tolerate and do. And, they may be right that this is really, the kid's like, enough. I don't want to go back to school in the summer. I want my freedom, and I'm done with where I'm doing it. And then there's other things that we can do in terms of like creative alternatives. So instead of providing a specific service makeup, it might be we're going to provide a specific device or technology that will sort of support and supplement that service need area. So if you had a student where they may have missed speech and language, we might provide an at-home device for them to use, and some training and support for the parents on how to use and incorporate that. Many kids' devices go back and forth, but occasionally we'll do something different. Additional technology, training, even in some cases, agree as an exchange to do some sort of a community option versus a strict education. Usually that's when it's like a social emotional thing. And we're, kind of making up some missed counseling or missed social skills and social integration. That may be an option. Again, these are all case by case individual assessments, and it's going to be based on what did the student miss, where did the student progress, where did the student struggle, and what is appropriate. And I always go back to thinking about the practical realities, which is, you know, do you have the staff to do it? And if you don't, saying let's do this within 3 weeks is not going to get it done. So you need to make sure that there's a way to actually practically implement that. You know, finding other providers, whether it's through district staff, contract agencies, or others, is an important thing to look into to try to make that available. I will admit that we've had a lot of issues with kids trying to access services before and after school because transportation is such a mess right now, because there are no transportation drivers or aides. And if you know anyone who's interested in becoming a bus driver, contact your local school district. They would love to talk to you, because that's been a major issue this year. And honestly, my experience is that a lot of parents, districts, and kids are done. I call it COVID fatigue. We're just done. And the idea of adding more things can be, you know, a little bit daunting. I think sometimes we need to say, you know, take a pause. I hear what you're saying, but maybe you want to think about it before you wave or step away, because, you know, our goal is if we feel that there was a deficit, we want to address it. We want to work with you and your child. And so sometimes maybe just giving them a little bit more time to think it over. And then, you know, we also have some situations where the parent and district could agree, instead of doing, you know, makeup services, we're just going to increase and go more robust with the current services for now, and really, you know, enhance what we're doing on a current model. And that sometimes may be appropriate. End of the day, it's all about finding that balance that works for the parent, that works for the student, that works for the staff, and that actually is designed to support the student and help them address those deficits or the area that they did not progress in, without necessarily turning them off, because you want to make sure that they're still engaged, because having more but not having their engagement doesn't, you know, provide that benefit that we're really looking for.
Hey, Tara,
All
can
right.
I jump in with a question?
Yes, of course.
Awesome. The question is, how would this process work with a child who aged out of Cpsc? Can compensatory services from Cpsc be provided if a child transitioned to CSE?
It's interesting because the timing is going to be a bit of an issue on that particular one. Yes, there's the ability to request and you know, seek Cpsc compensatory services. I think the issue will be one of how you can get that documented and how to document that in a way that it will be funded by the county, because there's two funding streams. There is school age programs, which is, you know, 5 through 21, and there's Cpsc, which is preschool services, which is 3 to 5. 3 to 5, the funding comes from your county. 5 on up comes from the school district. So if there are makeup services or compensatory services from the Cpsc, it's got to be on a Cpsc level so it can go to the proper funding stream. There are districts, and I've had a few where we have done agreements and supports for those makeup Cpsc services, but it does require like a bunch of extra steps, because in some situations the county or even the providers are saying, hey, we can't get paid for them because the IEP is already done, and now you've come to an agreement on services, and I can only bill for things that are on an IEP. So it's a little bit more complicated, so it's not as straightforward, but general answer is yes, you can, but it's going to require some, you know, specific workings and some collaboration and written agreements with the county and the district to make sure that those services are provided, but are tasked as a Cpsc service. Otherwise, if they just agree to services that could be delivered as a school age service, but if they're really for makeup for Cpsc, it should go through the proper agency and referral. And candidly, with Cpsc services, sometimes there's a little more flexibility because they have different providers that aren't tied up in school day services. So that may be a reasonable option. All right, so I know that Wayne has kind of had an opportunity to weigh in at different points in time because we've kind of, you know, kept dragging him into the conversation, but we did have, you know, a little bit of time set aside for a parent perspective, and I'll turn over to Shari and Mr. Perry if they want to weigh in on anything else.
Okay, great. Yeah, Mr. Perry did a fantastic job of presenting exactly what I would have said about our experiences together. And I gave him some questions just to think about. So I thought we would just have a conversation and I'll ask a question and he can share his response with everybody.
I'll do my best.
Mr. Perry, what was your experience with your child that led you to pursue this outside evaluation? And in your case, as you had mentioned, it was Dr. Cosgrove.
Well, number one, we go back to COVID because it was a crazy year. So we had a ton of behavior problems, new teacher, new school. And really everybody was very frustrated on all sides. We knew there were problems that were affecting my son, COVID, the new school, all those things, but we just didn't know how to kind of put it all together and figure out what was going on. And it really had to get to the point where we almost became adversarial, at least with some providers and such, to where, along with Shari and our educational advocate together, kind of, we discussed what can we do, to bring us all together. And that's how we came to getting this IEE. That was really what brought us to it. We really had to hit a wall where we just weren't sure what was going to happen at that point. It was almost, to me, a straw, like we had to do this or we could not move forward. So that's what brought us into getting the evaluation. Desperation, really. And it was the right thing to do. It got everybody on the same page because we actually had talked about this for several years. But, for a lot of reasons, it wasn't warranted at the time. You know how things go. But then once we hit that wall, everybody was in agreement, basically, that, this is our last resort. We've got to do this to really understand what's going on here.
I think you mentioned earlier, the behavioral piece was really key for your son. How would you advise any other parents who are thinking of an outside evaluation as far as what steps to take and what to do with their district?
Well, first of all, you have to find, the best professionals you can. And that means taking the advice of not only, the parents doing their research, but an educational advocate if you have one, but also listening to whoever your rep is with the Cpsc, because they are there to help your child. At least I'll say with my experience with Shari. The child always came first, and it's important to have somebody that kind of, I can see it's a tough job because you have to deal with the administration, you have to deal with the providers, you have to deal with the parents, but you have to make sure the child's being, taken care of. And I kind of lost my train of thought, but that's kind of how we got into it. My advice to parents, first of all, is yes, to find the right professionals, but also to be open to working with the school. You can't look at the school as the enemy that doesn't want to pay for you to get your evaluation or is keeping you from that, because I believe in most cases that's not the case. The other thing is, yes, a parent needs to look at, especially, even Dr. Cosgrove had said this, that having that behavioral piece helps her and her overall evaluation, because they really do work together. So, again, I can only speak from, my son's case, because he does have pretty severe autism and apraxia. So he has a lot going on. But it's very important to get that behavioral piece in there, because it totally affects how a child learns. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Even if the behaviors are small, and in my son's case, they were not small, but if you don't have that piece, I don't think you can get a proper evaluation. I really don't. And the other advice for parents is sit down and really read everything word for word and talk to the evaluator and make yourself present. Don't just expect that the evaluator and the providers are going to fix your child. That's not how it works. And people that drop their kid off at school and say, fix them, that's just not how it works. And you also have to be on the same page with the providers, with the Cpsc, with everybody, because if you don't carry over what you're trying to do in school to the household and vice versa, if you're not communicating, you're never going to be able to help that child at all. Or, you know, it's just, you have to work together on it. So I hope that's good advice.
I really appreciate your perspective, Mr. Perry, and you know, we've come a long way with your son, and just, you know, you've been a great family to work with. So I appreciate you sharing that with the other parents and anybody else that's on the call. Thank you so much.
Great. I hope it's helpful. I really think this kind of, you know, communication is really important. So.
All right, so this is where we would open up for any other questions. You can certainly, you know, ask any questions about the presentation. You know, we can give some general information. I would say if you have a specific hypothetical question, you know, be mindful not to disclose, you know, your names, the names of others, you know, school districts, etc. But I'll be happy to kind of try to give you some general guidance. I can't advise you, but, you know, in the capacity of sort of giving you a direction, maybe I can help in that way. Oh, and if you wanted to pose a question and were brave enough to ask it directly, don't forget to unmute yourself.
We don't currently have any questions in the chat, but to echo what Tara said, if anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute or if you have anything to share.
Hi, this is Ruth Fenley.
Hi, Ruth.
You know I'm going to have a question.
Of
But
course.
one of the things I thought of when you were talking was, what about the school district that doesn't have a speech person or an OT person? Because the workforce issue is so bad right now that what should a parent do at that point? How should they be advocating if there isn't, you can't get blood from a stone or a rock, whatever that saying is?
Yeah, I mean, I will give you an answer that is probably not satisfactory, but the reality is that if there isn't a provider, the district will need to be aware of the need to make comp ed services available to address that. I would, as a parent, hope to hear from the district of their regular updates as to their, you know, extraordinary outreach efforts. You know, I can tell you in terms of pursuit of these providers, I know many of my districts have contacted all of the education programs that are, you know, graduating these folks. They have lists of future graduates that are on the cusp of, you know, exiting at the end of December with the hope of, you know, offering them instant employment. They have reached out to other agencies to pursue options, and, you know, they've explored remote, virtual, and, you know, partnering with other districts. It is a problem where we just have a deficit of providers. A lot of people retired, others, you know, left the field, some moved out of state. So we are struggling in particular areas. What districts do have speech language in other evaluators or providers, I tell them treat them like gold, because they are, you know, that they are the only way to provide the critical services without increasing, you know, the obligation to address deficits. But it is, you know, it is a continued issue. And the best I can say is if they are unable to provide a specific service as, you know, currently reflected, you could also go back to committee and see, is there another way to sort of address it? Now, speech language is unique in many ways, especially if they're working on articulation. But if it's, you know, working more on social pragmatic, then maybe while we're looking for speech, we could look at, you know, converting to do some social work services or from, you know, some counseling service as a way of kind of, you know, bridging the gap on that particular need. Or in some cases, districts are just, you know, flat out embedding the social emotional program right into the education program. But it doesn't, you know, eliminate, again, there's still an obligation to implement the IEP. And I would just, you know, continue to say for the parents, ask the district, keep you informed of the search, and for the staff in the district, search nonstop and keep the parent up to date. It is a very significant issue, and there are, you know, some areas where kids had, you know, gone without a particular related service for 3 and 4 months, which is just maddening. But it is not because of a lack of trying to find a provider. You know, and unfortunately in these cases, my experience is that these are kids they've already deemed would not be appropriate for remote or virtual instruction, because otherwise they would have gone that route, because there are some avenues to provide that. And when it has to be in person and it has to be, you know, delivered by the particular provider, then it's going to be a matter of owing. But when you come back, that may, by that point in time, they may need to look at the frequency, duration, and intensity of what they provide going forward. It might have changed to the point where they need to really increase that in order to help offset the students, you know, shortfall of service.
Well, I know the district can be limited as to who they can contract with. So what if I had my own OT person or my own speech person that I was working with outside of school? Can I get reimbursement?
That's something that you could talk about with your individual districts. You know, it really is going to depend on the delivery of service and, you know, the qualifications of that outside provider and whether it's something that the district is able to do. Sometimes there are union and contract issues that preclude that. Other times they'll do that on a case-by-case basis. It often, you know, depends on the approach being taken. Is it a clinical medical model, or are they, you know, able to, you know, comply with and follow the educational requirements and you know, implement the services? Because some of the problems with, not problems, but some of the issues with out of district staff may be that they're, you know, they set their own goals and attendance, and it may or may not align with what the issues that were supposed to be addressed would be. I see that Tina Beauperlant has raised her hand. How very polite of you, Tina. Do you want to weigh in?
Well, I'm not going to open up my camera. I am having a bad hair day, but I have a few comments I'd like to make and a question to ask. One, I'd like to say, Wayne, you did a phenomenal job. And I loved your comment on the fact of parents and schools really need to communicate. That is the key factor. And that's where a lot of things break down, is that communication. When we don't talk, there's issues. So really nice job in pointing that out. So Shari, great parent to bring. So thank you so much for coming, Wayne.
Thank you.
The next thing I wanted to point out is that we're talking about independent evaluations, but due to COVID, there is a huge wait list for all evaluators, and we're looking at about 6 to 8 months to get into some people. So I really think that's very important for everybody on here to know, because they're kind of like, oh, there's got to be a shorter place that I can go to. It's not. And you have some independent evaluators who are in private practices, things like that. They're not back up and running. So I just really want to make sure I point that out to everybody. The second thing I wanted to bring up, I see that somebody put in the chat that they do education advocacy for people with traumatic brain injury. That's great. We do the same thing here at Parent to Parent. However, due to staff shortages, we are short on staff as well, but we are still here. We're assisting families. Now, the other thing that I have a question for you about, Tara, is I just got a phone call yesterday. And of course, I'm digging through federal and state laws on shared aids specifically.
Mm-hmm.
I have a parent who has a shared aid listed on their IEP, and a shared aid is typically used between 2 kids, typically. Okay.
It depends on what's on the IEP, but yes.
Right. You know, it says shared aid between this person and another child. Due to staff shortages, I was kind of stumped with this one. We're having a shared aid between 9 students. The aide is pulling her hair out of her head. She is threatening to leave. And we already know with the staff shortages, it's like, oh my God. So I have a parent panicking that there's 9 kids. Her IEP says one thing, but yet her kid isn't getting what he needs. And I'm making the assumption based upon the conversation that probably the other kids really aren't either. So where do I go with this one? 9 kids to 1 person? That's a lot.
This would be one of those hypothetical questions. And, you know, the answer is, again, not a great one. Here's what I can tell you. There is an obligation to implement the IEP as written. So if it is a 2-to-1 shared aid, then of course they're supposed to have sufficient aid coverage to provide that service. However, finding an aid at this point in time has become, you know, like finding a unicorn. Which has made it very difficult for districts to staff and support. There are, you know, at this point, if we're, you know, several weeks or even a month in and we still haven't found an aid, one of the other questions may be, are there other ways to provide enhanced or additional support? Could there be a class TA? Would there be, is there ability for, a consult or a push-in from other providers that may be able to supplement and support if it's a specific issue for a student? And are there other creative solutions? I've said to districts, this year is the year of we love student teachers, which may also, again, there's not an aid, but it may be a viable stopgap measure if that's another option. When we are at a staff shortage, that's when creative options can be helpful. But I don't have a solution as to what do you do. Would the district potentially have liability and need to review what, if any, makeup services or compensatory education they should provide? Yes. I don't know how to quantify necessarily easily the impact of the loss of an aid. But certainly we would be looking at the student's progress and performance, and if the failure to have that support over a long term impacted the student, that's something that the CSE would definitely have to look at and try to address.
All right.
And then I saw Christy Cornell, I think, a cute baby, who had a hand raised. So thank you.
Hi.
I don't have a little baby. That'd be so much more fun.
Oh, no, it's not when you're trying to work and try to listen. I'm actually home with 3 RSV kids right now. So I'm trying to
God bless you.
work. And I just real quick, and I have to read through all the slides still. That's why I asked it to get emailed. I have a child that has an IEP that's medical. She has developmental delays. She hasn't been to school since March of 2020. She is the only person in our district that's home right now this year. Because of my job, I'm in the medical field and I'm trying to maintain, I work full time. She gets a 20-minute Zoom and she gets a packet of work sent home, and that's it. And we decided to defer OTPT speech because I just can't do it. I can't do the 8 Zooms a day while I'm trying to work full time. So I'm not sure what I'm looking for. I have not had time to look into anything. I tried to get a tutor, but that didn't work out. They bailed the week before school. So I just am looking for some help or support.
I hear you. There's a lot to unpack in that. And, first off, trust me, you're not alone. There are a lot of parents who have been dealing with this. This kind of goes back to the COVID fatigue thing I talked about, that sometimes it's just how much time do you have to jump in and jump out. And that has been a challenge.
Right.
You're doing yeoman's work there with, 3 little ones plus working plus everything else. So God bless you. In terms of what your options are, again, you could go back and talk to the district about, adjusting, the frequency or duration of the Zoom meetings. Maybe they need to provide a little bit more. They could, potentially look at other asynchronous learning opportunities that may be more flexible to adjust to your schedule. So when it's asynchronous, if there's a video or an instructional video they can watch, if that doesn't work because we're not having a good morning at 9 a.m., you could potentially watch it at 3:30 when we're in a better mood. And that,
Right.
Gives you a little bit more flexibility. And those are some of the things that, the district could look at and talk to you about, in terms of deferring services and things like that. At some point there'll need to be a discussion about how to address and, resolve that. No services for a very extended period of time does make it difficult. So whenever you get back, I would certainly expect that they would do updated assessment and then program and recommend, frequency, intensity, and other services from that point, because
Yeah.
you may have a very different level of need for the child. And, other option is still, and again, it's up to a parent whether or not you want to do that. But right now, it sort of is like they're kind of getting, tutoring support, but it's a little bit different. As a parent, you also have the right to homeschool if you would prefer to go that route. There are written documents, things like that. I don't know if it would make your life any easier. Chances are probably no.
Yeah. I don't even have
But
the time.
that is still an option that you do have. So I think my general suggestion might be to go back and talk to the district and see if there's other, supports or strategies. Certainly you've got a lot going on, and, their ability to accommodate all of those issues may not be 100%, flexible, but there may be other things that could be done. And so I'd go back and have that conversation.
I was originally told that sorry, that's where I work. I was originally told that BOCES was going to be facilitating this. And we sat for almost a month since school started with nothing. We had nothing. There was it was dropped because she's the only kid in the district that medically frail enough to be home. So we lost a month just about. And, and again, I did this because thinking that BOCES, either she was going to be we were going to do something with BOCES where she could go and be secluded, or so I don't, I guess there's no such thing. But again, and all I'm looking for is there anything that I have access to help just everything she does? She's young. Everything she does, I have to be part of it. So I'm only one person, so.
Yeah, and compounding that is, if you have access to like OPWDD or other services, they will not provide services during the school day, which, adds another wrinkle of fun.
Right. So just reaching out. My email's there if any, and I'll read through everything, but I can put my email in the comments. Just, even just a parent to parent type relationship to talk to someone else. Cause this is the first I've ever experienced anything like this.
Yeah, and speaking of parent to parent, that may be a good resource. Tina Beauperlant, who did speak briefly, they may be able to kind of, look at other options of support that may be available. And again, I would go back and talk to the district and see, are there other, options? But again, I don't know that with a child who's home for health and medical reasons that, you'll be able to get more support that doesn't still involve, you being a direct involved person. Because if you have the children at home, if they were at school or if they were coming in, then you have the ability to provide those supports in a different environment, maybe have different staffing. But that's exactly the issue you're trying to avoid with RSVP. You don't want to have unnecessary exposure. So I understand the high wire balancing act you're trying to use.
Can I just say real quickly, just something, and I don't know if you do have this, but you should get yourself an educational advocate.
I don't even know how or where that.
Well, I don't know if you can do that for parent to parent, but there's also ALG, Alternative Living Group, and they do provide that. So like if your child has a diagnosis and has all that, you should be able to get that service. And that can be extremely helpful because that also provides you somebody to talk to. Yes, but also they can give you the options, but also they can help you talk to have somebody that can say, listen, here's your options. That's very helpful. I just, from parent to parent, I would.
Yep. I do have someone in New York City, which we're way upstate. We have a clinic that she has NF or neurofibromatosis and as conditions. They have educational advocates there. And again, it's because we did okay until March of 2020. And then with my job, I work for OPWDD. I've had to manage, because I'm a nurse, I had to manage COVID. So, I just haven't had time. So I need to make the time. First of all, I'm hearing myself say this, but I put
well, if you get somebody that's up here, an advocate that can help you, they can take a lot of that time out of your hands because they can start working on it for you and help you because your hands are full, Thank
you. Well, Christy, I put my email to Helen, so if
right. So Christy, I will be able to get access to your information from Helen. I will reach out to you. The other thing that we do underneath Parent to Parent is we have a family to family healthcare information center program that is federally funded. And Lynn Perry runs that. And that is dealing with kids that are strictly medically fragile in school. Okay. So I will definitely be reaching out to you, and then we'll probably have you connected with Lynn, and we'll try to make sure we schedule times to talk that are convenient for you as well. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for listening.
You're welcome.
The advice.
And I do hate to cut it short, but I know that we are at the end of our time and I want to be respectful so that people can hop off. I did see that Helen also reminded that Families Together is another resource for advocacy, and that again is another agency that you could certainly look to unfortunately, there is no way to bypass the outreach, but Tina's going to connect with you. And so at this point, I'm going to end. I don't know, Helen, did you have any other feedback on the evaluation of the program that needs to be done?
No, I will email everyone who registered a link to the evaluation. And one last thing to share from someone in the chat is Angela's house as another resource for people. So thank you all so much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.